Hi, I'm Dave Fisher from Flying Fish. Today's little project is changing some engine bearings on a trusty OS 105 engine. Engine bearings need replacing regularly because fuel tends to absorb moisture from the atmosphere. If it's left in the engine, you get a nice mixture, cocktail of watery, acidy fuel which destroys the bearings. So this is quite a common little problem we need to sort out. If your engine bearings are going, you can normally tell the engine starts to sound a little bit like a circular saw cutting into wood, a little bit like a chainsaw engine, a little bit rougher than normal. And also your idle disappears. If your engine stops constantly on idle, it's not normally a mixture problem, it's normally the bearings are going. So let's tackle this problem, have some fun. Okay, let's start off. We'll remove the items that are easy to take off. Crankshaft nut. Now we're going to remove the carb. So, appropriate Allen driver. And we'll just loosen the collet there. Sometimes these are a little tough to get off, but luckily this one's alright. So if you get a little bit of a sideways movement on there, rather than just trying to pull it out directly, we can pull the carb off. There we go. Ultimately we're going to be heating the engine up to get the bearing out, so let's take off all the components so as we don't damage anything. We just want the casing in the oven when we do it. This little collet here, it's got two little half moon shapes. I don't know whether you can see that there. Let's take out the other side, and this clamps the carb in place. So you've got two tiny half moon shapes there, and as they, you see that now? And as they pull together, they actually tighten onto the surface of the carb. That holds it in place, and that's pulled together with a little bolt there. Watch out, because there's a couple of O-rings on here. It's very easy to lose those or leave them in the case when you take it out, so make sure they're still on there, little rubber O-rings. If they leak, your engine tends to run a bit fast, it won't idle properly. So there we go, there's that. Next thing we want to do is take the cylinder head off. Whilst the head is on the engine, let's remove the plug, because if you try to undo the plug when the head's off, you can't grip the head tight enough to be able to loosen the plug, so we get that one out of the way. And if you are replacing the bearings, then you really want to put a new plug in afterwards to give the engine a good chance to run properly. Okay, so cylinder head, this is clamped down by 6 bolts on the top. We don't want to just loosen one bolt at a time. We want to just crack them, just click like that, just loosen them off, and you go diagonally. So I'm going to go across there and across there, and then we move over to here in sequence, and you notice I've just loosened them slightly, and that allows the head to be actually come off parallel, not get distorted. If you just undo one at a time, you can distort that cylinder head, and it doesn't seal properly, and then you have compression problems and the engine doesn't run properly. So there you are. Now they're all backed out. Now we can spin them out because they're actually not tight against the head. You don't have to Loctite the bolts on the engine here that go into the aluminium. So all these steel bolts going into aluminium casing, for instance the head and the back plate, they tend to actually, the aluminium grips them as they expand and contract. As the actual aluminium expands and contracts, it tends to lock them in place. The next thing we're looking at is taking the head off. Sometimes that will just come off in your hands, sometimes it will be tight because the head is pressed down onto a steel liner in the crankcase, and the aluminium is contracted on it. So if it doesn't come off, we use a little trick by heating it up with a heat gun. So if you look, that doesn't want to come off. Now what you don't want to do is lever this up. You're going to damage the actual fins on the engine. Not a good thing to do. If something doesn't come apart, never force it, there's a reason. So I'm just going to make a noise, a little paint stripper here, and just heat it directly onto the head. Should be enough. Let's have a look now. There we are, look at that, just comes off. There we are, it's quite hot actually. And you can see there's the steel liner. If we look at the cylinder head, there are no marks in there. If you've got any bits of the bearing that have gone up through the engine, you'll normally get little indentations, little pits in the cylinder head. That is not has not happened to this engine, so it means that the bearing is maybe rough, but it's not in condition that's damaged the engine. Let's just take the back plate off. One thing to really watch out for here with the HZ engine, the piston comes down quite a long way, and it can actually, I'll show you that. There we are, the piston's at the bottom of the, well, there's the bottom of the stroke. Piston at the top. And now if we pull this out, just give it a little twist like that, you'll notice that here is a little indent, a little machined slot in the back plate, and that is where the piston comes down there, and you can see the piston comes down lower than the crankcase, and if we were to try and pull that out without putting the piston up, we're going to damage the skirt of the piston. Okay, so watch out for that. Expensive if we have to replace the piston. So the next thing, we have to get this out, this liner. We are going to lift the conrod off the back of the crankshaft, the big end here, and we can't pull it out until we remove the liner. What I'm going to do is just put my finger inside here against the liner and just give it a little push, and I don't think it will come out. There we are, like, it's too tight. Okay, so we're going to use our heating up trick again to expand the aluminium. There we go. I don't know whether you can hear me very well, but we're just going to heat evenly around the crankcase there. Okay, let's try again. Look at that, easy. And that's with no tools, that's just my finger, so that can come out nicely. Before, well, we'll look at this when we put it back together. Well, there's a little tiny indent in here, and there's a little pin in the crankcase, put into the crankcase just here. Okay, and that little indent lines up. Be careful, don't twist that round as you pull it out, because the piston ring can pop out into these little transfer ports here, and if that piston ring gets jammed in there, you can't get it out without breaking the piston. So very careful on that. Now if we pull the conrod back this way, okay, we should be able to lift it off the back. There we are, lift it off the back of the big end, was over the top of that crank pin there. Okay, so I've just lifted it off. Now we can carefully push that out. Okay, careful we don't scrape the piston and damage it against the crankcase. And there we are, there's the piston. That looks in good condition as well. The piston ring looks in good condition as well, because that's actually still a black colour. If that was silvery colour, this piston ring, then you would find that that would need replacing. It's got a lot of wear on it, but this one looks good. And also, as we turn this round, there's a little pin in the piston where the two edges of this piston ring, they come together like this, have to locate. Okay, now if you don't assemble that back with those little edges of the pin either side of that, of edges of the piston ring I should say, if you don't assemble it either side of the pin and you put it in like that and try to jam it in, you can actually snap the piston ring. So when we assemble, we'll go over that again. I'm just going to remove this piston ring. You have to be really careful because this ring is made of cast iron and it will snap very easily. So if we remove it, we would gently just lift it out like that and carefully, just enough to come out over the top of the piston. And there we are. If we replace the ring, that's how we remove it. Now as this is going back on, we want to be really careful we don't put it in upside down, because it's been wearing on the engine this way round. If we were to turn it round, it wouldn't seal as well. So if you take it off like this, don't get it mixed up. I'm going to put it back on because we won't need to replace this. So over there, just pull it out just enough to go over the top like that, and let it go over the top and it pops back on. If you stretch that too far, it will snap. Okay, there we are. So that's that. Okay, let's also talk about the way the piston actually goes into the engine crankcase. If we were, that's actually the way it goes around. Okay, if we were to put it in backwards, not only the engine not run properly, it would have all sorts of issues, because the piston would collide with the crankshaft. It has a little cutout just here on that side of the piston. There's a little edge that's machined away, which isn't machined away this side. You can see that there. Okay, and if we put it the wrong way around, that would collide. But also on this crank big end that goes on the crank pin, if you could actually fit that, if you took that out and turned it round, you could fit it the wrong way round. But the trouble is, it's been wearing this way, and if you put it the other way round, you're now going to have a bearing that doesn't fit properly. And it's very subtle. If you look at this here, you would see, I don't know whether you can zoom in on that, but there is a chamfer on this side of the big end. On the edge of that little bush that goes in there, there's a little tiny chamfer that allows it to locate nicely onto the pin. And this side, it's just absolutely flat. There's no cutaway, no chamfer on it there. Okay, so the chamfer would go that way and go towards the crank pin. All right, so when we assemble it, I'll go back over that again, but something to watch out for. Now, if we look in here, we've got the crankshaft that will rotate there. That's going to come out now, and we should be able to, just a spacer washer, should be able to just push that back by pressing. Well, I didn't have to do very much, just pushing that back now, and the crankshaft is now out, and we have the bearing exposed, and that is ready to remove the bearing and the front bearing for the new replacements and to be assembled back together. So the next stage is, how do we get this bearing out? We don't hit it or tap it with anything. We need to heat the crankcase up enough so as the aluminium expands, and we've seen that earlier, and then we just give it a tap, and then that bearing should just fall out. We put our new bearing onto the crankshaft here, and we can slide that in. That locates it properly and gets it in nicely. If you try to heat this up and drop a bearing in by hand without putting it on here, what will happen is it will tip sideways and get lodged in the case, and then you might have to hammer it to try to get it out because it's jammed, and now you damage the crankcase. So we'll go through that. So we could heat it with the trusty heat gun, or if you're lucky enough to have a partner who will allow you to use the oven, we can put it in the oven, and that's a much nicer way of heating it up because we get even heating over the whole crankcase. What we want to do is get the bearings ready to go back in, front one and the rear one. So as when it's still hot, we bring it out, we get rid of this bearing, get rid of the front one, and we reassemble the new ones while it's still hot, and it all fits together nicely. Okay, so next, let's move over to the oven. When the light goes off, we know it's up to temperature, and it's time to take it out to replace the bearing. Okay, so
cool.
We'll wait for the light to go off. Got my oven gloves on, don't forget the oven glove. Right, we're ready, the light's off. Let's turn off here. Oh, look at that. Your pies won't taste the same after that. Okay, whoa. Now you can see, this is going to be hot. Very hot, but I don't want to burn the floor. Whoa, that's hot.
Or yourself.
Okay, there we go. You notice the bearings have fallen out already. Look, the front one's dropped out. The back one's, I'll show you when we get over there. That one's dropped out. There's one bearing, and if we just tap that, there's the other bearing, and you can see it's a little bit corroded there. Okay, but because that's so hot, we don't have to do any tapping and knocking to get the bearings out. 200 degrees is about right for temperature. Let's put some oil on the bearing. This helps the bearing when you're spinning it over and you haven't got any fuel in the engine. Okay, and we'll do the same. Well, we can't do the same on the front because it's sealed, so that's not a problem.
What oil is that?
Actually, Phil has got what oil is this? This is the same oil that goes in the fuel, so it's an oil which would normally be in the actual glow fuel. This here has a shield either side. That means it's packed with grease inside. Okay, so we have to remove one of the shields. If you notice, the original has only got a shield one side on the outside, and that there is going to be open so as the oil can get and lubricate it. So we need to remove that shield. And that's quite common, so I'll need to get something to get that shield out. Something sharp here to get in behind the shield. And what we have to be really careful of is we can easily snap the knife blade if we're not careful. And if we snap that blade, we now have got a hard bit of steel in the bearing, and you can't always guarantee you get it out. So what I do is just lift that up there, and then I've got a screwdriver that I can fit in there.
So you say that's a normal thing?
No, if that was normally these bearings, normally the bearings for the engine will only have one shield, but if you buy it from the bearing supplier, they sometimes will have a double shield in there. So I'll just get that there, get underneath it. We're not actually forcing into the bearing, we're just lifting the shield, and there we go, look, there's the shield out. Simple as that. Okay. Alright, so let's get some oil into that one. You can buy an after run oil, that's all you need for lubricating your bearings. Now what we've got to hope for is the casing hasn't cooled off too much since we've been messing around with the bearings. I think we should be alright. So this bearing here is a replacement bearing. It's a stainless steel one. It's not the standard OS bearing, but if you get equivalent size but with stainless steel, the bearing will last longer. So that slots on there, okay. And if I get my oven glove so I'm not burning myself, I can slot that through here. Okay. And now we can get the front bearing on here, and we have to push that bearing in, okay, to the crankcase, which is still very hot. Okay. So what I do now is I put this locking tool in the back, and I put the washer over the top here so as we don't crush the shield, and I've got a socket earlier which is just the right size. I should be able to push that down. What I'm actually hoping is Phil, whoops, there we go, Phil has got the right bearing, which he has. I was just beginning to wonder whether it's the right bearing. And you notice that I've got the locking tool in the back here. I've got the socket that fits just big enough to press on the inner of the bearing here, and now we're actually pushing the whole lot together as a sandwich in a proper way, so as we're not hammering the bearings, knocking the crankcase, we're compressing it all. Now what we can actually do is, if we get a block on here and we tap that down, this on here, we can now tap that safely without damaging anything. Okay, and that now has made sure that the bearings are seated in the casing. Alright, there we are. Now we can just tip that over like that and let that cool off a little bit. What you should find now is that should revolve very smoothly. It should be super smooth, so the crankshaft turns around nicely and the bearings are seated correctly. Now if you don't seat the bearings in correctly, what will happen is when you do the engine fan up, if the bearings aren't in the case properly, you start pulling the inners of the bearing together, and then the bearings now are stressed, they're actually pulled together, they're tensioned, and they wear out quickly. Plus the engine won't run properly, there'll be loads of friction, loads of heat generated, and the bearings will be gone in no time. So very important that we do compress the bearings and make sure they're fully seated in the casings. While it's still warm now, we can start reassembly. There are no marks on this whatsoever, and once you start to get scores on the piston, it's never going to run as perfectly as well as it would as new. Also you'll get scores and lines in the steel liner. Because it's steel and it's harder than aluminium, you tend to find that a lot of the scoring takes place on the piston, but if you've got very severe damage, you will get scores in the liner. Once you've got that, you have to replace both. So replacing the bearing more often means you don't have to replace these items, and these items are really expensive. In the UK, you know, you're looking at 150 quid to replace these two, and that's half the price of the engine. So looking after it's important. I can just about hold that now. Right, remember the piston ring? We said about the piston groove and the little pin. I don't know whether you can see that with the camera. We've got the little pin there, and we make sure that that piston ring is lined up with the groove. We look at the piston, and I know that this part goes towards the front of the engine. Okay, so that will go towards the front of the engine. And we're also looking here, another way, as we said, we've got the little chamfer on that bush in there. That shows that that's the front of the engine as well. I'm going to get some oil, and I'm going to run that oil around the piston ring. Doesn't matter if we get it all over the place, oil's good for the engine. But that's now sitting in the ring. When we spin the engine over initially, that's going to keep that lubricated. It doesn't matter if it's a little bit dry. Okay, so that's good for that. I'm also going to put a little bit of oil in the liner. Just put some around here. Just rub that in with my finger around there. That will help as well for the excess. And this is the tricky part. We get the crank pin at the top of the engine, facing the top of the engine. We've got to be a little bit careful we don't spin this ring round. Okay, so we're just ultra careful we've got that lined up again, either side of that groove. There it is. And now this chamfer, where is it? Let's get the right one. Yeah, this chamfer goes towards the back, so I'll go that way. Just checking. Where are we? There it is. Okay, so that's the way it goes in. Slot this in carefully here. You can see, and just put that over the top. And if you notice, let me just go back to this. This conrod can move sideways on the gudgeon pin, okay, or the wrist pin. And that allows us to be able to turn the crankshaft round and slot that over the top gently. Just fiddle, it's a bit fiddly, but just get that over there, and that should just slot in nicely like that over the top of the pin. And then what I'm going to do is put a bit more oil on that one as well. There we go, through there. And we have that engaged. So we now bring the piston down to bottom dead centre at the bottom there, and we can now line up this liner and slot over the top. What we might find is if it's hard to put in, we might want to heat that crankcase again. That's why I do this when it comes out of the oven, it's still warm. Okay, so we get the little groove at the front, and that slots in there. Just make sure it's lined up. And we are now lining up the little V groove with the pin at the front here. That makes sure all these holes, the transfer ports, are in the right place. We just bring that down. Just use a little finger just to position the piston central with the liner, and just push that down. Because the conrod is straight down here, as we push down it can't go anywhere. If we've lined the piston up, there's a little chamfer on the bottom of the liner which will push over the ring and squeeze the ring. So we just push that in gently. Don't twist it round because you can get that wrinkle. And we bring that down and line that up with the pin at the front. There it is, it's now in line with the pin. And now you'd find if you hold that in place, you can turn that over. If you have difficulty pushing this down, if you go to push it down, it doesn't just slot on like I've shown you there, take the piston back out and check that that ring is lined up with the pin, okay? Because if you haven't got it in the right place, as you push it down, you'll snap the ring off, okay? So that's now all ready to go. We can now put the head back on, and don't worry about the excess oil, that will soon burn out, okay? There we go. Now the actual head is symmetrical. It doesn't really matter whether it went on that way or that way, but I tend to like to put things back as they come apart, and I remember the OS logo was towards this OS logo. It's going to go on that way. The other thing to look out for is there is a little gasket here, okay, not a gasket but a shim, and look, we've got two shims on here, okay, and there's another one there. Let's just bring that out carefully. This engine is obviously set up for high nitro because the original shim is 0.2, and then when you run 30% nitro you would put another 0.1 shim on top. Okay, so I have to ask Phil, what's this going to run on? 20, 25%? 20. Okay, so we don't need this extra shim in. Okay, cool. So we can take that one out.
Good to know.
Okay, there we go. We're all happy there, that's lined up. The head is going back on. Be careful when you tip this out, the shim doesn't drop halfway out and get jammed when you tighten it back down. So looking at this here, that head won't go on properly. It's all cooled off. So same again, let's use the heat gun. Okay, let's warm that up. Once we heat it up, it should just drop on and we can position it nicely. So. Okay, that is quite well. I've got asbestos fingers, so be careful when you're holding these items. And there we are. If you notice, look, that goes on, and that's easily, I can just rotate that, whereas before it would be jamming on there. Okay, so now before it cools off, let's just put all these bolts back in, and we're going to do them up in sequence again. There we go. Now take this down carefully till it just touches the head, otherwise we'll pull it all sideways. Just touching, and we do that diagonally. There's that one. And notice I'm not using an Allen key because we get too much tension on those. You never get the things out again. Normal screwdriver type Allen set is all you need, hand tight this way. Okay, so now the head is on, and we should be able to turn that over nicely. There shouldn't be any friction, well, a slight bit of friction because you've got the ring against the liner, but it should be nice and smooth. Now be careful when you turn this over, because this conrod can actually pull back a little bit. It can actually still move backwards and forwards, and when you put the plate on the back here, you see there's a slight line around here where that has been spinning over. This holds that conrod back. Now if you turn it over here and you tip it that way and the conrod moves out, as you turn it over it can wedge against the case here, and you think, oh, what's wrong with that? Turn it a bit too much and you've damaged the crankcase. So if you are turning it over, be very careful of what I've just said there. So we wouldn't want to put the back plate on if we're going to put the engine fan on. Okay, oh look, and there's the engine fan. So we're not going to worry about putting this on just for now, we'll do that later. Let's get the carb on. Okay, so before we get the carb on, we have our two little collets. They're going to go in from either side. You've got to decide which way you're going to bolt your carb up from. You can do it from either side. When the carb's on, if you look, you've got quite a lot of bits and pieces in the way here, so it might be better to put the bolt from this side. Okay, so let's have the bolt side of this in there, and you've got the little half moon shape that goes facing forwards. That allows the carb to go in. If you put this in the wrong way round, you can't get the carb in. So that goes in there nicely. Make sure you've got it lined up nicely. And then what I do is I just put my finger against there, and that tends to swivel them to get them in the right place. There we go. The only screw I do use Loctite on is this one, because that's not actually going into aluminium, it's going into the steel here. So I will Loctite this bolt, whoops, there it is, that will go through once we put the carb in. And if the carb slots straight in like that, you know you've lined this up correctly. Let's get the carb straight. Okay. Okay, before I Loctite anything, I always use, a little bit of lighter fluid or petrol just to clean the thread off. Okay, and I'll get any residue oil off of there. See how much has come off? And that's, if you don't clean that off, then the Loctite doesn't normally work very well. So that's that sorted. Loctite on there, not too much. And we'll put that through, spin that up. Now before we lock it up, let's make sure the carb's in line. So you can line it up by eye here, but you've also got a little tiny line there and a little mark on the carb. If you line those up, better to line it up straight for the push rod for your throttle servo. So that's lined up. Now when it is lined up, press it down so you get a nice seal with the O-ring, and then we can lock this up. Don't have to go crazy with it. So you go to it's tight. Notice I'm using two fingers here, I'm not going crazy, and I just take it round probably a half turn. When it bottoms out, another half turn. Don't shear it off, just lock it up, and then your carb will be solid in there. Excellent. Okay, so we have the carb on nicely. That's all sealed. Engine's back nicely. We're now going to get the fan on. Okay, so we're now going to put this fan on. This is on a Horobo Turbulence. I haven't actually seen one of these fly for real, close up anyway. So I'm looking forward to getting this together and we can see the turbulence fly. So let's just get a bit of tissue here and we're going to degrease this nut. Okay, same again, anything that's going to be Loctited, get rid of that grease and oil. Put that through there.
So you do need to Loctite the nut, but not...
Yes, you do need to Loctite the crankshaft nut on there. That's it. And we'll just clean the thread up because that's obviously going to have oil on it. So let's just clean that. Okay. So now that's cleaned. You notice we've got the little spacer on there. That needs to go on. Normally in the manual it will tell you whether you need to use it or not. I'm going to ask Phil, do you know about the turbulence? Does it
No idea.
No idea.
We'll find out.
Well, we'll soon find out when we put it back together whether it's too high or not. And let's see if that slots on there nicely. Okay, so I've just located it. I'm now putting the crankshaft, so the big end is at the bottom dead centre. And we must use a tool like this to lock up the piston. So that goes in and that just stops that rotating with the slot there. And you notice there's a cutout here. That's so as it doesn't damage the piston. Some of these locks don't have the cutout and you've got to be careful driving that in because you damage your piston. So really make sure that you've got the right locking tool. Some people advocate screwing in a locking tool in the top here. On Zenoa engines they supply a locking tool. Obviously the piston has a lot of material on the top, so as it goes up it doesn't break, but you wouldn't want to use a locking tool in through the top here. As you tighten this up it would just shatter the piston, so make sure you use the proper tool. Okay, here we go. So now I've got that locked, I can just give that a little bit of a turn, and before I put that down I'm going to put a little bit of oil on the crankshaft here, not on the thread but just on the crankshaft where the collet goes. It just makes it easier to get off. It'll still grip the shaft but I always use a little bit of oil on the collet. So that's down. We've got our crankshaft nut there, so we're going to just put a little bit of Loctite on the inside of that thread, don't need too much, and we can put that on there. There is actually a little steel insert that's in there, so there's no washer that goes on here because there's a steel insert. It's not up against the aluminium. We just locate that and then we can use a socket here. Let's take that off to spin that down. Now this is where you would find out if your bearings aren't seated properly. Remember when we tap them down? When we tighten this up, if this engine goes tight, we know that we haven't seated the bearing correctly, so I'm just going to tighten that up. That would be enough, that would be sufficient to see whether the engine is jamming up. Super free, that is lovely and free. So the bearings are okay. So let's tighten that properly. This crankshaft is a dropped forged crankshaft. It is really strong, so we can afford to get quite a little bit of tension on that. Okay, so I'm going to hold that, the locking tool is in, and I'm going to beef that up. And that's tight. I haven't gone crazy, but it is tight, okay? And that's locked in place. Let's wipe away the excess. There we are, excess Loctite. And now, as I say, that turns freely over the whole range. Rotation there, that's nice, whole stroke I should say. And let's put the back plate on. Remember, piston needs to go up, so as we don't damage it when we put this in. We can put a little bit of oil around this O-ring if we like, just to help it seal. Okay, just a little bit around there. As I say, you can't put too much oil in here. And there we are. That fits on nicely and locates. And we can put the screws in the back. No Loctite on these either because you've got steel bolts going to aluminium. You tend to find that heat, the expansion, contraction, the aluminium actually bites and holds that thread. And you find when you go to undo them, you normally get a little bit of a crack when you undo them. Not too tight, just knit them up. And there we are, that should turn freely, shouldn't actually have any resistance. Yeah, you're going to have a little bit of, you'll feel the compression of the engine even though we haven't got the plug in as it draws in air through, but you can feel it's not binding at the bottom of the stroke, it's super free, so we know the engine is fine. All that remains now is to put the clutch on and then it can go back in, but that's the engine rebuild for you. So there's the clutch there, and we'll do the same with these. Let's degrease them. Look at that, that's gummy, isn't it? Okay, so that's a bit cleaner now. I need to go crazy, just bottom few threads, just get that round like that. There she goes, and we can just put that in there gently. With any component that has multiple screws, never tighten one up first. Always make sure you've got them all in and take them down evenly like we have with all the other engine components. Spin that down and that will make sure that the component seats nicely. There we are, just bottom that out very gently like that. Once they've bottomed out, you can just tweak them up and then you can get some tension on them. There we go, ready to rock, all finished. Excellent, hopefully that's helpful. Good luck with your projects. If you carry it out like that, you shouldn't have any problems.